When great powers hesitate, the world leans in, because hesitation is never neutral. It sends signals, and signals get read. Iran watched closely, so did America's allies, and so did America's enemies. One moment, the message was clear. If they keep killing people, we will hit them. Hard. The next moment, restraint. Assets moving but no strike. Was this weakness, or was this discipline? That question matters more than any missile, because power today isn't just about force. It's about credibility, about whether threats mean something after they're spoken out loud. I want you to pause here. If you care about how global power actually works, not how it's sold in headlines, this is the conversation you should stay for. Subscribe, stay sharp, because what looks like calm is often something else entirely. And to understand why restraint can be more dangerous than action, we need to first define the problem everyone is dancing around. This is not really about Iran, and it's not really about Greenland either. It's about something more fragile, the architecture of deterrence. For decades, American power rested on a simple assumption. When the United States speaks, the world believes there will be consequences. But consequences require capability and credibility and a willingness to accept risk. In the Iran case, the dilemma was stark. Military action might weaken the regime, or it might harden it, push protesters closer to power, or push an entire population to rally around the flag. The same tension appears elsewhere. Pressure allies, threaten tariffs, float territorial ambition. Is this leverage, or is it erosion? Because every threat that isn't followed by action changes how the next threat is heard, not just in Tehran, but in Moscow, in Beijing, and inside alliance rooms where trust is already thin. To understand why restraint feels so risky right now, we have to look backward to the history that shaped this fear of acting and this fear of not acting at all. Power doesn't collapse all at once. It erodes quietly through memory. The people making decisions today are haunted by earlier moments. 2009, when protests surged in Iran and support stayed rhetorical. 2013, a red line in Syria, declared, then withdrawn. Those moments taught a lesson, not just to adversaries, but to allies and to the protesters themselves. Restraint became associated with regret, action with catastrophe. After Iraq, after Afghanistan, force stopped looking decisive, occupation stopped looking temporary, and regime change stopped looking controllable. So a new instinct formed: avoid the ground war, avoid the guarantee you can't make. But history has a counter lesson too. Regimes that survive moments of weakness often become more brutal afterward. More confident, more insulated. This is the cycle leaders are trapped in. Act and risk chaos. Don't act and risk entrenchment. And that unresolved tension is exactly what exploded when the Iranian regime faced mass protests again. Because this time everyone remembered what happened last time. And memory in geopolitics is never passive. The violence changed the equation. When a regime starts killing at scale, it's no longer governing, it's surviving. That was the moment everyone noticed. The moment restraint stopped feeling abstract. Because this wasn't theory anymore. People were dying, publicly, systematically. And suddenly the question wasn't should the United States act. It was what happens if it doesn't, behind closed doors. The calculation was brutal. An airstrike might weaken the regime, or it might fracture the country, pull the United States into something it could not finish. And yet, not acting had its own cost. It risked teaching the regime that mass violence works. This is where credibility becomes emotional, not strategic. Emotional, because leaders don't just weigh outcomes, they weigh how history will judge hesitation. If you're trying to understand why this moment felt so dangerous, why the tone shifted without action. This is why. And if you're thinking this crisis was about missiles and targets, you're missing the deeper machinery at work, because the real decisions weren't happening on the battlefield. They were happening inside the system itself. What sits beneath all of this is a quieter mechanism, one that rarely makes headlines. Regime change does not begin with bombs. It begins with fracture. The question inside Washington wasn't can we strike, it was what happens the day after. Because force alone doesn't topple systems, it tests them. In Iran's case, the security apparatus held, the protests didn't split the regime. The military stayed loyal. The internal pressure never crossed the threshold. That matters. Applying force without internal collapse doesn't end regimes. It consolidates them. This is why quiet tools matter more than loud ones. Information, connectivity, exposure, helping protesters communicate, helping the world see, weakening capacity without triggering nationalism. This is slow power, uncinematic, unpopular, but history is unforgiving to shortcuts, because when outside force becomes the story, the regime stops being the villain, and the country becomes the victim. That is the hidden trap, the one leaders fear most, and it explains why the second crisis was always going to be more dangerous than the first, because once restraint is visible, everyone starts testing its limits. The testing didn't take long. Taunts resumed, signals hardened, assets moved closer. This was the second peak, more dangerous than the first, because now the risk wasn't violence, it was miscalculation. When both sides believe the other is bluffing, history accelerates. The Iranian leadership saw restraint and wondered how far they could push it. The White House saw provocation and weighed what backing down again would cost. This is where deterrence becomes unstable, not because of action, but because of uncertainty. A strike might escalate, no strike might invite more. And once credibility becomes a variable, every actor starts improvising. All it takes is one wrong read, one overconfident assumption, one moment where restraint looks like permission. That's why this phase felt tighter, more compressed, less forgiving. Because unlike the first crisis, everyone now understood the stakes, not just in Tehran, but across the region and inside the alliance system watching closely. And when pressure builds at the top, it never stays there. It travels downward, straight into the lives of ordinary people. If you're watching this from a safe distance, it can all feel abstract. Strategy, credibility, deterrence. But if you're inside the system, you feel it differently. If you're an Iranian citizen, every signal from Washington matters, because mixed messages are not neutral. They raise hope, then suspend it. You hear encouragement, you see restraint, you wonder who will still be there when the cameras move on. That uncertainty is exhausting, and it's dangerous. Because when people take to the streets, they're making a calculation too, about risk, about timing, about whether the outside world will look away. Support that arrives loudly and leaves quietly can be worse than no support at all. This is the human cost of credibility gaps. If you care about foreign policy, this is where it stops being academic. This is where real people carry the weight of decisions made far away. If this analysis helps you see that more clearly, stay with me, share it, because understanding power is the first step toward holding it accountable. And once you see how individuals are affected, you start to understand why this moment didn't stay local for long. What happened next was inevitable, because credibility doesn't collapse in isolation, it ripples. Every signal sent to Tehran was heard elsewhere. In Europe, allies watched uneasily. Pressure tactics, tariffs, threats toward partners, not adversaries. In Denmark, panic wasn't about territory, it was about precedent. If leverage replaces trust, alliances stop being anchors, they become transactions, and transactions don't hold under stress. This is how local crises become systemic. Iran tests restraint, allies test commitment, rivals test boundaries. Suddenly, the question isn't what will the United States do? It's what rules still exist. Because once power looks improvisational, others start writing their own scripts. This is how order frays, not with explosions, but with doubt. And when doubt spreads across the system, the future stops being linear. It becomes conditional, which is why the most important question now is not about what happens next week. It's about what kind of world these signals are building toward. There are three paths from here, none of them clean. The first is restraint that holds quiet pressure, behind the scenes support, information flows restored. The regime weakens slowly from within. No dramatic collapse, no decisive moment, but violence becomes harder to sustain and legitimacy continues to drain. This is the patient path. It preserves alliances, avoids war, and bets that systems rot before they reform. The second path is managed escalation, limited strikes, clear signaling, just enough force to restore fear, not regime change, deterrence repair. But this path depends on precision, and precision is fragile, because once force is used, control becomes a hope, not a guarantee. The third path is failure of restraint, a misread, a provocation too far, a response that escalates faster than anyone planned. Allies fracture, rules collapse, and the story becomes about power, not people. History suggests this is how systems break. Not because leaders choose chaos, but because they underestimate momentum. None of these futures are decided yet, but all of them are being shaped by how credibility is handled now. And that's why the final question isn't about strength or weakness. It's about judgment, because judgment once lost is almost impossible to recover. Power is not the ability to strike. It's the ability to choose when not to. What this moment exposes is not a lack of options. It's the cost of living between them. Threats without follow-through hollow credibility. Action without strategy hollows legitimacy. And once both erode, the system that kept conflict contained starts to fail quietly. Iran, Greenland, alliances, tariffs, these aren't separate stories. They are symptoms of the same stress test. When power becomes transactional, order becomes optional. And when order becomes optional, the people who pay first are never the ones making the decisions. If you take one thing from this analysis, let it be this. The most dangerous moments in global politics are not when leaders act rashly. They are when they hesitate without clarity. Because the world doesn't pause while credibility is debated. If you want to keep seeing power explained as it actually works, not as it's marketed, subscribe, stay with me. The next chapter of this story is already being written.